Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have this focus today in this webinar on the Cuba emergency. What should Canada do? My name is Ted Jackson. I have the honor to serve as chair of the Group of 78. Most of you know that we're an Ottawa-based foreign policy nonprofit. We work for peace, climate action, and just development through policy dialogue and public education. And my job is just to get us started. Today, we have an excellent group of expert speakers to take us through this pressing issue, the cruel and unprovoked blockade on Cuba by the U.S. administration that threatens humanitarian disaster. Canada has a long and rich history of productive relations with Cuba and its people. Our government, civil society, and businesses need to step up to meet this moment of crisis. The critical issues here include food, energy, tourism, people-to-people partnerships, links with Mexico, and yes, the question of U.S. interests in regime change, among others. But first, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, who've lived here for thousands of years at this gathering point at the confluence of three rivers. We recognize the damage perpetrated on land and its original peoples by our colonial institutions. As a foreign policy nonprofit, we support the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Group of 78 has much to learn and much to do integrating Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into our work and in working in partnership as an effective ally with Indigenous organizations. Miigwech. So it looks like we're going to push about 100 people here on this call, maybe more, and this indicates a very strong level of interest. And I know many of you who are registered, and I know you have strong experience and networks to bring to bear on the Cuba emergency. I know you're interested in taking action. There's a wealth of talent and commitment online today. It's my pleasure, though, to now turn it over to Professor Laura MacDonald. Laura is one of Canada's foremost political economists and an authority on civil society, human rights, and trade in Latin America. She's a Chandler's professor at Carleton University, a former director of the Institute of Political Economy there. Her bio is in the webinar notes, and her publications are extensive and insightful. Very lucky that Laura has agreed to moderate today's session. So, Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Ted. It's great to be here. Welcome to our audience and to our speakers today. And a thanks to the Group of 78 for hosting this important and timely webinar. As everyone here knows, although the wider world might be losing focus with the ongoing military actions by the U.S. government and Israel, Cuba has been facing a profound humanitarian crisis precipitated by the U.S. capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, which ended Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba, and followed by Trump's announcement of the imposition of debilitating tariffs on any country that shipped oil to Cuba. This threat was aimed mostly at Mexico, its second most important oil provider. Mexico capitulated, and now we're thrust into this current moment of severe crisis. Our panel today will provide important insights into the causes and consequences of the current crisis, the impact of the crisis on ordinary Cubans, and what can be done by Canada and Canadians and others to help respond to the crisis. We have two excellent speakers. First, we'll have, sorry, can somebody turn off their mic? If you're not on mute, please mute. Thanks. We have two excellent speakers. First, we have John Kirk, who is Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University. He's the author and or co-editor of several books on Cuba and has published extensively on Cuban foreign policy, political history, religion, medical internationalism, and other themes. He's been traveling to Cuba for decades, most recently in April 2025. So he's an incredible resource for in-depth knowledge of the Cuban government and Cuban society. Our second speaker is Ron Berzand, who over the past 18 years has led 28 groups of Canadian farmers, students, and food security advocates on agricultural tours to Cuba. He most recently returned from Cuba on February 18th of this year, so he's bringing on-the-ground experience, the impact of the sanctions and the current crisis. He's worked closely with several Cuban state and NGOs, facilitating agroecology, permacology, and urban agricultural movements throughout the country. And I'm sure he'll talk more about what else he's been doing when he's at home. He's co-founder of Blueberry Commons Farm and Housing Cooperative in Powell River, BC. So welcome to both. John is going to speak first on the background to the emergency, and then Ron will speak about the view of the crisis from Cuba, highlighting the human dimensions. Then we'll have some time for discussion and a Q&A, followed by another round of short presentations by our speakers, another Q&A, and then final remarks. Before we start, I just want to point out that Mode from the Group of 78 has posted a fun activity for everybody, which is to share. If you look at the chat, she's posted it there so you can read that, but please just write a word or a couple words about your response to the current emergency. So thanks for that, and we'll come back to that activity later, but first over to you, John.
In 10 minutes, I have to give the background to how we got to this emergency. And it's very straightforward. The United States has been interested in purchasing Cuba, taking over Cuba, controlling Cuba since the early 19th century. Tried to buy Cuba twice from Spain. Spain rebuffed it. The so-called Spanish-American War, 1898, the U.S. took control of Cuba, ran the country until 1902. Two American generals ran the country. When they left, there was unpopular government for several decades. U.S. Marines intervened twice. We all know that Guantanamo is in this quasi-legal status that comes back to the whole idea of being on Cuban soil, but controlled by the United States. This continued till 1959 when the revolution took place. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over. The United States was very displeased with some of the reforms that were brought in. 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, 1,500 Cuban Americans, armed, trained, paid, transported by the CIA, tried to invade Cuba, to liberate Cuba as they saw it. The missile crisis in 1962, all of these things provide background to what is the current situation. January 1961, the U.S. broke diplomatic relations with Cuba, and that remained until Obama, a decade ago, was able to bring that to an end. The Obama administration brought amazing change to Cuba-U.S. relations, had a major impact in liberalizing the Cuban economy. And then came Trump 1, and during the first Trump administration, there were some 200 anti-Cuban measures that were brought about. The most significant was including Cuba as a terrorist nation. Restrictions were placed on remittance money, on investment, on cultural, sports, musical exchanges. And so the very negative view of the Trump administration going totally against everything that had been done by Obama. Then we have Joe Biden. Joe Biden basically can be described as Trump light. The basic significant difference was that in his last week in office, he took Cuba off the list of countries that support terrorism. Then we have Trump 2. And within a year, the Trump foreign policy has changed the world. In the terms of Latin America, we know that the Gulf of Mexico became the Gulf of America. There were threats against taking the Panama Canal back. There were threats about invading Mexico to try and fight the narco war. Today, I found out that there are troops now in Ecuador fighting the narco war. The threats to take back the Panama Canal. And Cuba became the center of attention, largely because of the role of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Rubio is a Cuban American. His political life in Miami for decades has revolved around bringing regime change, and that is exactly what he has intended to do. Fast forward to this year, to the last month, January the 29th, Cuba was termed by the president an unusual and extraordinary threat, quote unquote, to U.S. security. No oil was to be allowed to come to Cuba, and the idea was to grind Cuba down. As Laura had mentioned, the Venezuelan oil was cut off. This had been providing 30 to 40% of oil to Cuba. Mexico provided some oil until President Trump threatened to bring about tariffs, and also reminded President Sheinbaum about the CUSMA negotiations. This is the background to where we are now. Now we have most recently the threat of a quote friendly takeover of Cuba. That's where we're at. So what we're seeing now is the end result of 2 centuries of the U.S. having a blind spot in its interest in Cuba and wanting to take over and to control the Cuban economy and bring about regime change. That's the current status. And over to you, Laura.
Great. Thanks, John. That was actually very rapid. So thanks for that. You got through your time in 5 minutes instead of 10, so we have more time for Ron, or you can add more later on. Now Ron will talk a bit about the nature of the current emergency and how it's affecting Cubans.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, John. That's super important context, because what is happening today is not new. This is a further intensification of an economic aggression that has been applied to Cuba for many, many years, as John pointed out. So Cubans, having just been there and speaking to people about the latest crisis, the response often for many Cubans is, this is nothing new. We're used to this. We've been dealing with this on one level or another for an awful long time. And that is true. They have been dealing with this, and yet the situation is, I think, in most people's estimation on the ground in Cuba, more grave, more serious, more difficult than it probably ever has been. In fact, to a person, people who I've spoken with recently and said to them, how does this compare to the special period, the time when the Soviet Union collapsed and there were plenty of hardships and shortages? And to a person, people will say that it's worse today. It's worse today. It's different today. And the main reason it's different is that people are not equally impacted by the crisis. There is a segment of the population today that is involved in the private sector, that run small businesses, for example, that have access to money. And there is indeed food and fuel to some extent available in the country if you have the money to pay for it. Most people do not. So it's become very serious. And I would say for some people, it's, the word desperate is not too severe of a word. But it really depends on who you are and what your economic status is and where you live. So a couple of things just to unpack a little bit of what's going on in the country. So it does relate a lot of it to energy, for sure. And that energy is sort of twofold. There's the power crisis, or the electrical grid crisis, which was in crisis in a pretty significant way since about October, November of 2024. They had the whole grid collapsed for a couple of days. The whole country was in darkness, and that was very, very disconcerting, very disruptive. And then the grid came back up and then it went down again, and it's been sort of on and off. But fast forwarding today, people are in a situation where they are generally getting, in most of the country, 2 to 4 hours of power a day. And that means you have 2 to 4 hours in which to try to cook your food, try to power your cell phone. If you have an electric vehicle, which many Cubans do now, and smaller vehicles for the most part, you have a couple of hours to try to power that up. There are exceptions. Highly touristic areas are protected more, and if you live near a hospital, for example, the grid is prioritized for those areas. But generally speaking, there are widespread blackouts, apagones, as they're called in Cuba. And yeah, it's really hard to describe in some ways the degree that this interrupts normal life. The other difficulty of it is that you do not know for sure when that 2 hours or 3 hours of power that you're going to have will come. So you may have to wake up in the middle of the night if you're a farmer and get out there and irrigate your crops because that's the only time that your pump is going to work. So it's created a great deal of stress for people, for sure. And this has touched everyone, even those that do have more means. People are very much impacted by it. And it is very much related also to the shortage of fuel, of fossil fuels, because most of Cuba's grid, about 70% of it, 75%, is powered by thermal electric plants that burn mostly crude oil and turn it into electricity. And the plants that are around the country are failing. They're Soviet era, older plants that have not been well maintained and that have been burning a lot of the Cuban sourced oil because Cuba produces roughly 25 to 30% of its own fuel for powering these plants, but it's of a very low quality and it's very damaging to the thermoelectric plants. So they're failing, they're collapsing. This was going on before, but it's even worse now. So I was there in November also of 2025, and I was in the eastern part of the country just after Hurricane Melissa. And for sure, there were lots of power outages there as well. But now it is predictably down to a couple hours, 3, 4 hours at most a day in most parts of the country. So you can imagine what implications that has for people's lives, as I already described a little bit. And the lack of fuel available means that most people cannot access gas for cooking. A lot of people have propane or natural gas stoves. They cannot access electricity for cooking. So you see this phenomenon now of people cooking on their front steps or on balconies with charcoal throughout the country. Perhaps one of the only sectors that's really benefited from all of this has been the charcoal makers who are doing a very brusque business. But even that has more than doubled in price. Everything that's sort of a necessity to people that they cannot get through state channels, they're buying on the black market or through private enterprises, which are now fairly numerous in Cuba. 11,000 registered micro, small, and medium businesses that are really keeping the economy going in many respects. But it's unaffordable, unattainable to most people. So just for an example, when we were there, on the black market, eggs were about $4 a dozen, $4 American a dozen. And most Cubans who are working in a state job, which is the majority of the population, earn somewhere between 10 and 20 US dollars a month. So this gives you an idea of how impossible life will become for someone who's dependent on their state wage. In terms of accessing fuel for vehicles, right now there's a system in place where the only people that can access gasoline, if it's available at all, you have to register, you have to have a vehicle, and you're put in a queue, and you have a little app on your phone that tells you when your turn is coming up, and you get a maximum of 20 liters. And that's probably about, I don't know, once every 2, 3 weeks that you might have access to that. So there are a lot of people that make their living, by moving around. And so this has completely disrupted lots of livelihoods as well. With that, the public transportation system that people depend on, the municipal bus services within cities and between cities have been largely curtailed and are almost not running. It was already pretty inadequate, but most Cubans do not own their own vehicle to get around. So a lot of people cannot get to work. And some workplaces are even reducing hours or closing down. So this is a really big disruption. And if you're trying to visit family or stay in touch with people, you just simply can't do it. Lots of big events, festivals, cultural events, trade events, etc., are canceled because there's just not the fuel to move around. So, I mean, I'm just going to pause for a minute and say that all of this being said, there's no chaos in the streets. There's no rioting or looting. There's still this sort of dogged determination to get through, which Cubans are extremely adept at doing, and definitely don't want to romanticize that. But because of the experience of the special period and another 30 odd years of shortages of everything, pretty much, Cubans have learned how to improvise, adapt, innovate, and they're continuing to do that. And it's amazing. That's the sort of really incredible part to see. There is a resilience that's developed within folks in the country. A little bit on food and food access. The real concern for me is the fact that, well, many of the bigger state farms, which still produce a fair bit of the food in Cuba, they depend on running machinery, diesel tractors. Diesel in the country is almost completely unavailable. We had to buy it on the black market when I was there with a group, even to power our tour bus, which was supposedly given priority, and we couldn't get it at the regular stations. And even at that, we were paying $8 a liter for diesel fuel, which is completely out of reach for an average Cuban. But even state farms are going to run into trouble, and they are running into trouble. And the small, more independently owned farms, if they have gas-powered equipment, they're in trouble. Some of them have solar. There's a massive movement in Cuba towards the adoption of solar energy. There have been massive state initiatives, 49 solar parks established within the last year and a half, I think, with help from China. This is making a big difference, but it's not enough for the current need. So a lot of Cubans, if they can get access to resources, are putting in their own solar. Small farms that we visited that had solar could continue to produce. But if you cannot run a pump to irrigate your crops, or you cannot run the basic machinery that you need, you're not going to be able to continue to produce food. And the reaction of that is sort of a delayed one because, there's the period of growing and then the period of harvesting and then getting it to market. The impact isn't felt immediately, so we'll feel that down the road. And I think the other thing is that in parts of the country, Hurricane Melissa did take out a lot of agricultural production in the fall. So the food situation is a big concern. And yeah, people are struggling to get their basic needs met for sure. That's without a doubt. Again, if you have the cash, you can find it, and if food is still coming into the country through other channels. Another aspect of daily life that's impacted that one might not consider is water. Simply having access to potable water. So most homes in Cuba have a cistern on the rooftop, whether you're in an apartment building or a ground level sort of place. Water gets pumped up into a holding tank and then fed by gravity into your into your taps. But if there's no power to get the water up there, or no power to move to run the more industrial pumps that are moving the water through the system, you don't have access to water. And even that water in many places in the country is not potable. You have to sterilize it by boiling it. And if you do not have power to boil it, you're subject to having to drink unsafe water. And I know that is happening for a lot of people. The other thing that is really hard to see, but is a direct consequence to not being able to run trucks and machinery, is the buildup of garbage on streets, in neighborhoods, corners, etc. Garbage is simply just being piled up because people don't have an alternative. You either burn it or you pile it in a corner and you hope that a municipal vehicle will come around and be able to handle it. And sometimes it waits for weeks and it's very unpleasant. And, it attracts mosquitoes with potential viruses and rats and other very unhealthy things. So, yeah, so this is some of what's going on. Hospitals are struggling for sure. Surgeries are canceled. Ambulances can't run like they normally do. School hours are curtailed for many students because there's inability to power the schools, banks, long lines to be able to try to get money out, because if you can't open a computer because there's no power, you cannot allow someone to have a withdrawal out of their account. So lots of things like that. And the final thing that I'm just going to mention here, because I'm sure I've used up my time and maybe some of John's, is just the collapse of tourism. And this was personally for me extremely heartbreaking to witness, and in my view also very unnecessary. So Canadian, as everybody knows, I'm sure, the three principal Canadian airlines canceled all of the flights. I was on the very last flight out of Veradero on the 18th of January. It was an Air Canada flight. Meanwhile, flights from some European countries continue, from Turkey, from Mexico, and to go to a hotel or even to travel on your own. It's still very, very doable in Cuba, but our airlines, for some reason or other, and we could speculate on what the other might be, kind of did a wholesale cancellation of tourism. This put thousands and thousands of people out of work, because so many people work in the tourism industry and depend on it for their families' needs. Not to mention the state revenue, which is, extremely dependent on tourism. And Canadians are something like 65% of the total tourists that go to Cuba, up to 1.3 million at its peak before COVID. That had already dropped a lot during COVID, was starting to rebound. And this is a terrible blow. And then it also affects all of the small independent businesses like the restaurants, the Casa Particulars, tour guides, all those people that have that connection to tourist income. So that's super, super hard for people. And I think it was also, my sense is people felt abandoned by that in the country and confused by it, and understanding to some extent. But that was really hard to witness, and I think the impact of that remains to be seen. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, Laura, and look forward to further discussion.
Great. Thanks, Ron. That was incredibly interesting. And thanks to both of you for your important comments. So I just want to remind people, if they have questions, could you please post them in the Q&A section of the website or the Zoom program. And if you've already put a question in the chat, you could cut and paste it into the Q&A. I'll be taking those questions soon. But before we go there, I would just like to ask John if he wants to add some more comments. We have about 10 minutes to have further discussion on this topic. So over to you, John. You're muted, John. John? John?
Yeah.
You're muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that what Ron just presented was a terrific analysis of what's going on. At the moment, the United States government is bound and determined to do what in 1960 under Secretary of State decided to do. That is to grind the country down, to make people starve, become so frustrated that they will rise up against their government. That's the game plan of Marco Rubio. There are three main sources of income for the Cuban economy. One is tourism, one is the exportation of medical services, and one is remittance money. There are attempts at the moment to stop remittance money coming into Cuba from the United States, and also to stop all flights from the United States. Three Cuban American Congress people are presenting that. In terms of medical internationalism, the exportation of medical services, which is a major source of income, this past two months, the U.S. has been threatening to try to end this, and the way they've done this is very underhanded. They've sent pressure upon various countries in the Caribbean, as well as Guatemala and Honduras, which have broken contracts with the Cuban government in terms of medical internationalism. And tourism, I think that Ron made the point very clearly. I think that the Canadian companies jumped the gun. Iberia is still flying, France is still flying, Aeromexico is still flying. We jumped, we were too nervous. possibly because of political pressure. I don't know. But the US government is trying very, very hard to bring about regime change in Cuba. And the idea of having a friendly, what was the term that he used? A friendly administration or whatever. That clearly flies in the face of the current activity. The United States is bound and determined. Marco Rubio is, and I think that Trump is probably following along. He's got enough on his foreign policy plate at the moment in terms of intervention. But this is causing tremendous suffering. Will we reach the point where the 1960 prediction of strategy is brought about? Who knows? Hopefully not. But at the moment, the pressure upon the Cuban population, the humanitarian needs are extraordinary, and they are being exacerbated by US policy.
Thanks. Ron, do you have any other comments you want to make? And people, please post questions in the Q&A.
No, I think John just hit the nail on the head there too. I think it's exasperating to a lot of Cuban Americans why there hasn't been widespread revolt in Cuba, and that is a very interesting question. I think that what people forget is that there is a very strong, I would call it kind of a type of nationalism in Cuba, a fierce kind of independence and defiance that whether you sort of subscribe to the current government or not, or to the socialist project or not, there's a strong sense of not wanting that foreign intervention or, Cubans wanting to determine their own future. And I think even with those whom I'm speaking to who are anxious for change at the government level in Cuba, they want it on their own terms, not something imposed. And so, but it is a really terrible strategy to see, especially the most vulnerable people being forced into a situation where maybe they have no choice but to take to the streets and, for their survival. I'll just share really briefly. This was a bit chilling, but a friend of mine who is in Cuba fairly regularly had an email from a person who is one of those people who just does their state job and doesn't have access to outside resources. And the title of the email was "Just Trying to Stay Alive." And she shared that with me, and it was really super heartbreaking because what happens in this situation is people spend so much time and energy just trying to get what their basic needs met, really. Long times in lineups, time spent scouting around for things that they're looking for, doing whatever they can to hustle to make a few bucks to be able to afford things in the black market. So, yeah, for me, I've seen more frustration in people in this last year than I've seen before. I think a lot of that is just the grinding of the blackouts, and there's still a lot of people who are determined to resist. So there's a lot of things going on at the same time.
Thanks, Ron. I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the hemispheric context of what's happening now before we go on to the Q&A. Of course, the situation in Cuba has its own dynamic and its own, as John pointed out, its own unique and long history of imperialistic actions by the United States to try to intervene in Cuba and take back Cuba. And the very important, we haven't really talked about this, but the very important domestic political impact of the Cuban American community, which has played an inordinately important role in U.S. foreign policy over the year, which is a bit hard to understand. So there is a very specific U.S.-Cuba dynamic, but at the same time, what's happening right now is playing out in the context of a hemispheric and even global dynamic, which I would characterize as being neo-imperialistic, and which involves threats not just to Cuba, but also to Greenland, to Canada, as we're well aware. Venezuela, Mexico also has been suffering a lot of threats on the behalf of the Republicans and the U.S. administration that the U.S. will go in and take military action against the cartels if Mexico doesn't, on its own accord, do what the U.S. has been telling it to do. This has been accompanied by neo-mercantilist trade policies that also have a devastating impact, and it is a continental strategy. If you I believe it's happening today. There's something called the Shield of the Americas Summit happening in Miami today. It's March 4th today. Yes. With right-wing leaders of the Americas, including people like Milei and Bukele, gathering together. I think Bukele's there. Chavez, Noboa, Bukele, right-wing leaders throughout the Americas have joined together in Miami with the Trump administration. You would think Trump had other things to do, but not sure what's happening there. But and beyond that, you have the famous Dunroe Doctrine being articulated as part of the U.S. national security strategy that came out in November 2025, in which, in kind of a stunning fashion, it was articulated what America's core foreign policy interests were. And point number one was this so-called Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, saying that, just to quote, "We want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well-governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. We want a hemisphere whose governments cooperate with us against narco-terrorists, cartels, and other transnational criminal organizations, a hemisphere free of foreign incursion or ownership of key assets, et cetera, et cetera." There's a broader vision here of sorts. At the same time, I would think there's some contradictions here between the idea that the U.S. doesn't want an upsurge in migration, yet is engaging in destabilizing activity in Cuba and Venezuela and elsewhere. And also, I personally think if the Cuban regime were overthrown, that would leave vacuum for the entry of cartels into the Cuban territory in a way that we haven't seen as much under the current Cuban government. So there's just a few comments from me, and we can come back to those if you guys have any other comments, but I'll go to the Q&A now. There were some questions about why aren't they burning garbage, and I saw Karen Dubinsky, hi Karen, is talking about that as well, that there is burning of garbage, and she mentions the threat of airborne diseases, mosquito-borne virus outbreaks. There's a question, a couple of participants have urged that supporters of Cuba break the blockade. How feasible is this? That could be also part of our next discussion, but what would that entail? Why don't I raise those two questions for now, and then if we have time in this round, we'll come back for other questions. John?
If I could address the breaking the blockade, I'd like to quote someone, see if you can recognize where this came from. "Principled in our commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty and territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter and respect for human rights." Who said that?
Carney?
Carney at Davos. I think that beautiful words, but I think that the government of Spain has shown the last couple of days that it can stand up. I think the four words were "no a la guerra," no to war, that the Spanish leader enunciated yesterday. I think that Canada is facing very difficult situation because of CUSMA, because of threats from an unpredictable president next door with a massively powerful economy. But I'd like to think that Prime Minister Carney was able to practice what he preaches, to work with Mexico. The Mexican government, I think, has been far more courageous than the Canadian government. They're facing the same CUSMA threats, Yet I think Claudia Scheinbaum has been remarkably courageous and I think also helpful in providing government to government food aid, providing oil until she backed off after major threats from Trump. The government of Brazil under Lula, the government of Colombia have also suggested working together. I would like to think that Canada would have the courage to work with like-minded powers. Because I think that breaking the blockade, showing some moral integrity, as the Prime Minister announced in Davos, is very important for our national sovereignty.
Thanks, John. We didn't see Carney take such a bold stance on Iran. In fact, he seems to be backing down today from his, I would say, foolish endorsement of the U.S. and Israel military action against Iran. So maybe there's sober second thought happening there. But I'm not holding my breath. Perhaps, Ron, you could talk to the question of what's happening with the garbage and mosquito-borne viruses. And there's also a question about what has happened in Cuba around the possibilities of opening businesses. I'm not sure if that question is about foreign businesses or Cuban-owned businesses, but I suspect it's foreign investors.
Okay, briefly on the garbage scenario. Yeah, it's quite variable place to place, actually. And on this recent trip, we were in the city of Remedios, which was squeaky clean, and as was Sancti Spiritus. So it's handled at the municipal level, and so depending how each municipal government is allocating resources, it's either terrible or it's not so bad. But yes, you're not technically allowed to have a pile of garbage outside your house and burn it. So that's, and it's not safe to do that because, like anywhere else, Cuba has a lot of plastics in the garbage these days, and that creates very harmful toxins to do. So what does seem to be happening is a lot more informal dumping outside of cities and on street corners, waiting for it to be taken up. I haven't seen big fires of garbage in cities, and I hope that does not happen, but probably on the outskirts more so for sure. So, but the real challenge is just moving that waste material from place to place and dealing with it. Sorry, what was the other question?
Opening a business in Cuba.
Yes. So this is something that's quite misunderstood. There's a thriving private sector in Cuba. It has limitations, and small business owners are frustrated often. But there are 11,000 registered, what are called MIPYMEs, which are micro, small, medium businesses of 100 or less employees, and it's an extremely vibrant part of the Cuban economy. John might know what percentage of the Cuban economy happens through those businesses, but and then you add on to that the black market, the unregistered businesses. There's plenty of activity and quite a bit of foreign business too. John probably knows more about those than I, but I mean, Canada, for example, has a tradition of a few things going on there. And Sherritt, which is a mining company, has been there a long time and shut down operations recently in the area around Moa, nickel mining. They've done some oil exploration in the country as well. So there's lots that could be done to encourage more of that for sure from the Canadian side. I would love to see that. And I just want to, I can't resist but to just affirm what John said around the courage to live our convictions, and Carney coming out of Davos talking about the middle powers. What an opportunity to actually do something. But I think it has to be with other nations. I can't see Canada going it alone. But if 4 or 5 nations, Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, maybe Mexico, Canada, start to declare that they're moving shipments of oil to Cuba to save lives, I don't know what the US would do to resist that. And frankly, regarding CUSMA, does it make any difference if we capitulate at the end of the day in our bargaining position at CUSMA? And we've seen such erratic behavior from the U.S. administration. Who knows? We could do everything that they tell us, and it might still be a bit of a gong show when we get to the table. So, who are we as Canadians? And part of our identity has been to forge a bit of a different path with Cuba than the United States, and I really hope that continues.
Laura, if I could add something about the 11,000 small and medium-sized businesses. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that there is tremendous innovation in Cuba, tremendous ability to get things done. The fact that they have survived 67 years despite having threats of regime change show that. But I think we also have to accept criticism. And I think that the Cuban government, in many ways, has made some major blunders. In terms of small and medium-sized businesses, there's an awful lot of paperwork. The bureaucracy is excessive. Trying to import stuff directly, you can't do. You've got to, the state has a very heavy hand in the management of the businesses. I think as well, the bigger picture, the Cuban government made a major error in putting all the eggs in the tourism basket. In Havana, you've got lots of five-star hotels that are empty. The Cuban government decided that tourism was the way it was going to do, and that's where it put the money. A final criticism, which I think is important, is the dollarization. The Cuban government needs dollars to buy stuff on the world market. And this is very difficult in itself, precisely because many companies are subsidiaries of American corporations, or are afraid of upsetting the US government. And so as a result, they won't sell. So as a result, you need dollars. And the problem with that is that not everybody has dollars. So 10% of the population lives very well. 10% can get by, but an awful lot of Cubans, I think, as Ron pointed out, are having a very difficult situation. So I think it's important to bear in mind some of the economic problems that need to be ratified. The Cuban government yesterday, President Diaz-Canel mentioned the need to bring about economic change, but the same arguments have been made for 20 years and very little has been done. These changes have to take place.
Great. Thanks to both of you for those great comments. There's a whole bunch of questions now. Thanks, everybody. But I think what I'll do now is pass the word back to our speakers, John and Ron, to address issues that are coming up in a lot of these questions, which are, and we'll do this together, two questions as Roy said in the chat, Roy mentions that Canada's offer of humanitarian assistance to Cuba was very modest. So could you guys talk about how much the Cubans need and how much Canada could give or should be giving? And what should we be giving specifically? Both the Canadian government and ordinary Canadians. How there have been some mention of individual initiatives that have been launched, and this is really a notable feature of the Canada-Cuba relationship, that so many Canadians have been to Cuba that they have a strong personal ties to the country and want to help out. And then more generally, what do you see as like the future? What can be done in general, either by Cuba, by other allies, and by Canada to move beyond the current crisis? So maybe I'll start with Ron.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think there's sort of the immediate term and kind of the longer term, and there's slightly different responses. But I think at the moment, basic human needs have to be given priority. So that is definitely food and medical access, hugely important. And some of the channels that are available through the private sector are helpful, but as I mentioned earlier, that does not touch everyone in the country. And the people that are most vulnerable and who are suffering the most from the blockade have the least access to the private sector and the black market. So I think that, like, without some fuel coming into the country that the state has access to, because the state runs the grid and the state runs the hospitals and the state runs schools and most everything that is needed for everyday life, it's not going to be enough through the private sector unless there's a way to channel that then to the state. But I'm not sure what that would look like. But yeah, so I think that Sorry, now I've just lost my train of thought a little bit on that. Yes, the amount that was given, the $8 million is a drop in the bucket for sure for any kind of emergency aid. I mean, routinely we support other humanitarian emergencies around the world to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So I don't know, it felt to me like this was sort of the least that could be done and still be on the record for doing something. And I mean, I guess I would personally say at least a tenfold increase of that to sort of meet the current and the needs that will be on the horizon for the next year or so. And yeah, the channels that that goes through, for sure, through UNICEF, which is, I believe, where most of the $8 million was earmarked to go, is good, and hopefully that will reach the people that need it the most. There is something that we haven't mentioned that is quite unique to Cuba, that for the longest time, Cuba has had what's often called a food rationing program, but that's a little bit of it's prone to misunderstanding. There are stores that Cuban citizens go to with their little librita, which gives them the right historically to have enough food to exist on every month. Now that has almost been completely eliminated to the point where there's almost nothing provided, but that infrastructure remains. So getting food to people through those bodegas, as they're called, where they were formerly there to ensure food security for people, but that is a state-run apparatus. So I can't see how that, how the problem can really be fully addressed without some support going through to the Cuban state. So I'll just leave it there for the moment, and then John can pick up and we'll go from there.
Yeah, go ahead, John. You have to unmute though, John.
Okay, there we go. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Canada's got a remarkably good record in providing humanitarian relief after hurricanes and natural disasters in Cuba. Done a remarkably good job, and after Melissa in particular, the folks in the Canadian Embassy in Havana did an excellent job assessing the needs, visiting the place, interviewing the locals, providing and delivering a lot of humanitarian assistance. That's why I was very disappointed when along came the current crisis, and this is a humanitarian crisis. We should not be fooled that this is a short problem. This is a crisis. People are going to die unless this gets resolved soon. There are 32,000 pregnant women at the moment who are having difficulty getting medical tests in hospitals, precisely because there's no fuel for in the generators. And while there are some solar power has been provided, nevertheless it's a serious problem. So I would like to see Canada significantly increase the aid it's given at the moment. You may have seen in question period about 10 days ago, Don Davis of the NDP and I think it was the Green Party raised the issue of let's give humanitarian assistance. Anita Anand then responded, we are looking after Canadians who are stuck in Cuba. She deliberately refused to answer the question. That was cowardly and that was callous. Since then, the Canadian government has provided some funds, but it is chicken feed compared to what we should be doing. By contrast, Mexico has sent on 2 occasions 2 Navy ships loaded to the gunnels with food. Milk powder was and beans was the second one, and there were a lot of other food on the first 1,200 tons and 800 tons. I know that Canada doesn't want to upset our neighbor to the south by providing bilateral aid to Cuba, and that's why it goes through UNICEF and the World Food Program. But there must be Quebec dairy farmers who've got all kinds of milk that could be turned into milk powder to be provided to the population of Cuba. Anyone who's ever seen a child looking for milk in Cuba knows how difficult it is to get milk in Cuba. We've got a surplus. Let's provide that. Let's use our churches. Let's use our NGOs. The government should increase what we've given, and should also double, triple what the NGOs and community groups come up with. One of the things that's interesting is there are about 16 or 17 solidarity groups in Canada which are filling containers to send to Cuba. There's one of Cubans resident in Toronto who are working on that 19th container to send to Cuba. Extraordinary. So let's try and challenge civil society in Canada and get the funding from the federal government to work. This is a humanitarian crisis, and we have very special relationship with Cuba. It's important that we use that special relationship and help those people who badly need it.
I'm going to jump in a little bit, Laura, and yeah, that's really a great direction to take this. And there are, NGOs in Canada with lots of capacity who have a track record in Cuba. Canadian Red Cross has an appeal going on right now. Care Canada is a large appeal going on, and there are plenty of smaller NGOs as well. The Canadian Food Grains Bank, which has done lots and lots of famine relief work around the world and disaster relief, and is a coalition of church-affiliated groups that works with farmers in Canada to access surplus food, to be able to make it available. I'm not aware that they have any presence in Cuba now or historically, but they certainly have the experience and could be encouraged to do that. The United Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Canada have presences in Cuba. There are other organizations like Not Just Tourists, and the Canadian Cuba Network is one of those examples of the sort of Cuba solidarity groups that John referred to. There are lots of them going on, and I don't think people have to look too far to find them. Myself and some colleagues, after being in Cuba this last time, realized that solar power for farmers, independent farmers, was critical, and we're raising some funds to help farmers put in solar, and there's the capacity there to do it. It's just the capital at $4,000 or $5,000, which is not a lot, but out of reach for most people. So yeah, there are plenty of ways to even move additional aid through NGOs, through churches, if we can't do it bilaterally. And again, I think the priority has to be on those that are most vulnerable and making sure that the food can arrive to them as well.
If I could, I'd just like to raise a question for either one of you about other actors. So there's a question from Greg Chin about the role of China. If we could expect China to step in at some point to protect its ally or to provide humanitarian relief. And then I also was wondering about Brazil or other Caribbean states who are, in the crosshairs there, right next door, whether they're able to or have shown any signs that they're willing to step in to provide support to Cuba. Do you know anything about that?
China is rather concerned about Cuba, but not in terms of providing a lifeline. The Chinese government is very disappointed in Cuba in many ways because it has given lots of assistance and Cuba has not paid its bills. The Chinese are not very keen on that. China has provided a tremendous amount of solar panels, as Ron mentioned earlier, and that has been remarkably successful. But in terms of major assistance from China, you would expect it would be in Chinese advantage to do so, but they haven't. Likewise, Russia. Not only because of its invasion of Ukraine and its own financial difficulties, but Russia has also been very coy about talking the talk but not walking the walk. So the two great allies, in my opinion, have not done enough. Now, bear in mind as well that Cuba has provided medical assistance throughout the world to scores of countries since 1960. These countries, 165 of them voted at the UN General Assembly a few months ago to condemn the US embargo, but very few of them have actually delivered. The Caribbean countries who you mentioned, it's a very interesting example. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has been particularly critical. She has allowed American troops to train prior to the removal of Maduro in Venezuela. And Trinidad and Tobago, along with several other Caribbean countries, as well as Guatemala and Honduras, have also broken their agreements that they had to bring in Cuban doctors, nurses, and technicians. Now, the bad news about that is that it sort of reduces funds going to Cuba, But more importantly, it also cuts off medical aid to patients, many of whom for the first time in their lives had a doctor or a nurse to help them. Again, callous foreign policy. But I think that in general, the backers of Cuba so far have been Mexico and to a certain extent Spain, to a certain extent. Colombia and Brazil have talked about it, but so far not too much has come. Likewise with China, apart from the solar power. And Russia must be the big disappointment, because the Cuban foreign minister, who's an extremely sophisticated, successful politician, he's been beating on doors throughout the world. And I don't think that he's got the returns that Cuba needs or that would have been expected from allies.
One small little point to make, is I think we forget sometimes too that even within the United States, there's a lot of organizing of advocacy for Cuba, despite the broader politic. Lots of different citizens groups, church groups, Pastors for Peace for years has been taking caravans of much needed supplies to Cuba. So there is that presence in the United States too. And I mean, I know that their voice is very marginalized, of course, in this current time, but hopefully they can continue to have some influence, maybe in some ways, maybe in some swing states with coming elections, et cetera, to be able to tilt the political climate a little bit away from the direction it is right now on Cuba and the US.
Thanks. There was another question about finding a way to make some larger political statement or protest statement in newspapers, a petition, press conference. Is there some kind of strategy like that could be considered or is being considered? I know I have signed at least one petition. I know petitions are going around, and perhaps someone could post links in the chat if they're aware of such an initiative. And hopefully it will be debated more in Parliament. Ron, do you have any suggestions about that?
Yeah, I too have signed some petitions that have been coming around. It's an interesting thought. I don't know if I have the best suggestion for that. Maybe John can add what he thinks might be more effective. But I think it's true that there are so many Canadians that have a real tender feeling for Cuba. And I think we can identify with Cuba in this moment in terms of our own sovereignty and, the difficulty of navigating the current U.S. administration. So how do we express that? How do we encourage our leadership to take some appropriate steps? And so I think some sort of public show of that nationally would be a good thing for sure, and might encourage some bolder, leadership on the part of our federal politicians, whether that be an ad in the newspaper or some mobilization. I'm not sure.
John, you're muted. Unmute.
Okay. There is a petition going around, and if people have a pen, it is E-7082.
Okay, Jim Hodgson has just posted the link in the chat.
11,000 Canadians have signed this petition that was put forward by a Quebec MP, basically calling for Canada to support Cuba. I've just finished a second book on Canada-Cuba relations, and one of the chapters is a series of interviews with 20 diplomats, 10 Canadian diplomats, some serving, some retired, and the same for the Cubans. The Canadians talked about their time in Cuba. The Cubans talked about their time in Canada. What was interesting was that almost to a person, the Canadian diplomats talked about the enormous respect and surprise they found when they came to Cuba to see just how closely the Canadian-Cuban people-to-people ties are compared to Canada to Mexico ties or Canada to Colombia ties. You arrive on a plane in Cuba and you see Canadians with an extra suitcase full of medicines, full of candies, full of toys for the kids, full of clothes. You don't find that in other countries to the same extent. And what was interesting, several of the Canadian diplomats sort of said, we were very aware of the significance of the people-to-people connection, and politicians would be foolish to ignore that. Precisely because for us, for them, for domestic political purposes, it's always good to beat ourselves on the chest and say, look, what great nationalists we are. We stand up to the Americans. But also, it's very important that in terms of elections, that there are so many Canadians, 800,000 last year, and at 1.3 million at the peak. About 30 to 40% of those are repeaters. They're people who go back to Cuba, who've got very good contacts. These are people who belong to the solidarity groups and contribute to the NGOs and write to their MPs to get back the form letters from some sort of machine that turns it out. Politicians would be foolish to ignore the level of support that the Cuban people, not necessarily the Cuban government, but the Cuban people have with their Canadian counterparts. And these are ties that go right back to 1962. Every country in the Western Hemisphere, apart from two, broke relations with Cuba after pressure from the United States. Those two countries, Mexico and Canada. In 1976, Pierre Trudeau was he was the first leader of a NATO country to go to Cuba. Remarkably significant. Those viewers from Quebec will know the FLQ crisis, 1970. When Pierre Laporte, the Labour minister, was assassinated, and the British High Commissioner James Cross was kidnapped. The only country that would accept the FLQ terrorists was Cuba. Cuba tried very hard. Canada tried very hard to get other countries to take the terrorists. No one would. So there are very profound historical ties. The fact that Fidel Castro was an honorary pallbearer along with Leonard Cohen and Jimmy Carter at Pierre Trudeau's funeral, requested by the family. These are very profound ties. The diplomats know about these ties, and I think that Anita Anand should be more aware of the fact that loosening the purse strings a little bit more and giving more than $8 million would be a very good idea.
Thanks, John. I wanted to mention that from a historic perspective, Canada's unwillingness to support the U.S. blockade on Cuba has been a fundamental element of Canadian foreign policy in general towards the world. And the idea that Canada has an independent foreign policy was sort of launched in a way around the issue of Cuba. And more recently, we've seen some discussion in the CUSMA contacts, the Canada, US, Mexico agreement, about the idea that Canada should adopt basically the same tariffs as the United States, and we should form some kind of common market with the United States in a projection of US power, I would say. And that would imply that we would have to adopt the same trade policy towards Cuba as the United States has always adopted. So that's a big reason for concern. And also, given that Canada and Mexico both have the same historic stance on Cuba, I think this is another way in which we can find unity as we go into those CUSMA negotiations and forge common ties with each other. I wanted just to lead into a discussion about some political issues, that some of which are raised by the audience. Bessa Whitmore asks for us to speak about the Miami Cubans. She says, I assume they're not monolithic. So are there Cubans in the US who are supporting the Cuban government, and do they have any political clout? We used to hear that the younger generation was less interested in the embargo. They wanted to go to Cuba. They wanted to support their friends and family members there, and weren't as hardline. But I'm wondering how that has changed with the MAGA movement, which seems to have a strong foothold in Florida. And we did see this crazy scheme, reminiscent in a way of the Bay of Pigs, where a bunch of Cuban Americans got on a little boat and decided to go attack Cuba, where they were rapidly intercepted. So that's one question, is about Miami Cubans or a US-based Cuban community. There's another question about how high Cuba is on the list of priorities and what is now a very busy administration on the foreign policy front and the military front. So how important is Cuba? I think to Rubio, yes, this is always been what's been in his mind since forever. And he has made a real mark on the policy in the Western Hemisphere. But for Trump, I'm not sure exactly what their hope would be to attain. We saw in the case of Venezuela, they didn't go for regime change, which is what Rubio seems to want in Cuba, but rather found a friendlier interlocutor in the Venezuelan government, Delcy Rodriguez, who is willing to do a deal with them. But Venezuela has oil. So what exactly might be the end game of the Americans if they're not going to achieve regime change, which seems to me pretty likely the same question one might have of Iran. And I'm just, and then there's been a lot of talk about Fidel Castro's grandson, and he's been mentioned as one person in the current administration. Raul Castro's grandson, who and the grandson is currently bodyguard to Raul Castro and lead advisor, as I understand it. So he's been one person mentioned. Are there other people who might be lining up to try to do a deal with the United States? Any political insights would be greatly appreciated. Ron, do you have any insights?
Well, you've named a lot of different things there, so I'm going to circle back to the kind of the earlier question about support in Florida, Miami. The one element that I want to just raise here is that I believe in the last 10 years, 2 million Cubans have left the country, mostly to the United States, but to other countries, increasingly to other countries now. Brazil, I think, is the number one destination, but Spain and other places too. And if I'm not mistaken, there are 200,000 approximately Cubans who are in Mexico waiting to try to have a chance at immigrating into the US. So, the historic sort of preferential treatment whereby if you just arrived at an American border and you were Cuban, you were let in and streamlined into an immigration track, that no longer exists. And Cubans, just like many others in the United States, are caught in this web of immigration crackdown and abuse and illegal incarcerations and all of that. And it's terrible. I've heard some heartbreaking stories of Cubans who've been in the US for 30 years, picked up off the street because they don't have citizenship and ending up in Alligator Alcatraz and other places like this. So I think there is some erosion of support in the migrant community, at least. I mean, there's the entrenched people who left in the 60s, 70s, and that's not going to change, I don't think at all. But I do think there is some diversity of opinion in that community, for sure. And I think that the sort of unfailing MAGA support is cracking because of the immigration reality. And just so people understand, like for many of these folks, if they're sent back to Cuba, they're going back to nothing because in the most cases, they've sold their homes, they've sold their cars, they've left their businesses or whatever they had. And, they're coming back to super difficult circumstances. So whether that, registers or not, but, and certainly there are those really anti-regime voices that take most of the oxygen in Florida. But in my view, there's more diversity than one would think. Maybe John wants to add to that.
Every year, Florida International University has a poll, and every year, apart from the first time that Obama was elected, Cuban Americans have overwhelmingly supported Republicans. That continues to be the case. There are some clear signs of younger people who are displeased with the old guard running the political scene in Florida. And I think that, as Ron mentioned, since the arrival of ICE, it would be fascinating to see how those views have changed. I would suggest that they have changed quite dramatically, precisely because the Cubans, who used to be privileged big time, you arrived in, and unlike any other anybody, even more than any other than Canadians, than anyone else from Latin America, or much less from the global South. If you arrived in Florida and you kept your nose clean for a year and one day, you got a green card. No longer. So as a result, Cubans are now like everybody else. They join the lines to get in, and increasingly it's becoming difficult. So I think that the possibility of Cubans now, Cuban Americans supporting Trump the way they did, I think that has decreased quite dramatically. Younger people always were more open, but younger people, as the case in Canada, don't vote as often as they should. So that's clearly a challenge for the Democrats if they want to get their act together to try to mobilize younger people to vote. In terms of the second point, what is Trump after? Rubio clearly is involved with the whole regime change concept. Trump, I think, has not thought through what he really wants in Cuba. Friendly, management. It seems so ridiculous. When you look at what he wants to do to bring about a massive change in the way the country is governed and the economic system is run, it is silly and it is naive. You could make the same case as to what is happening at the moment in Iran. He seems to be not the sharpest knife in the drawer when it comes to what's expected in terms of follow through and the impact in the Middle East. A microcosm of that is Cuba. I don't think he's got a plan. I think he's being pushed by Rubio, who does have his agenda, and perhaps what he's keen on doing is just making a bunch of money, opening golf courses, getting jobs for his friends, and that might sound awfully simplistic, but I think that's because his goals seem to be simplistic. Everything he's said so far is sort of so crazy. It just doesn't make sense for the leader of the so-called free world. So I don't think there's any master plan that he has.
I was thinking, as I was preparing myself for this, around what steps Canada might take, what steps the international community might take, and I had this fantasy, I guess it really is, that maybe Pope Leo could be called upon to facilitate dialogue. He's an American and a deep history in Latin America, and there's a tradition of Pope Francis mitigating dialogue between Barack Obama and Cuban high-ranking ministers. Is there some channel there that could open up that, and I think, I'm trying to get a sense of both Rubio and Trump's psychology. They have to come out of this with some kind of a win, and whatever that win looks like, maybe that does mean Diaz-Canel resigns or is replaced. And I think personally, that's probably a reasonable thing for Cuba to entertain, because he's not a popular leader, maybe not a very effective one either. So there are probably things that Cuba could do to try to give the U.S. a bit of a win, or a perception of a win. And as John has pointed out, there are real changes that do need to happen for the country to function and to meet people's basic needs. So the problem with my fantasy is that it assumes that there's somebody on the American side with whom you can negotiate and have a conversation and be in dialogue with, and I just don't know if that's the case. Whether or not that has any chance of any positive outcome whatsoever. But whatever channels can be open, and this latest one with Raul Castro's grandson, Rodriguez Castro, he's a funny character from what I understand. He's sort of a bit of a playboy, and he's not particularly in this time of crisis. He's a guy who's on social media showing pictures of himself in nightclubs and on yachts and things like this, and it's, for the Cuban population, there's some baggage there, but again, maybe it's a fresh enough face for something to happen and a some kind of a perception of a win to be achieved?
Thanks.
Last week, the U.S. ambassador to Cuba, whose responsibility was to be in Cuba and defend U.S. interests, was in Rome. And he is and then went to Calabria, where there are 300 Cuban medics working, again trying to break the contract to stop money coming in to Cuba and to give Cuba an international black eye. Didn't work. The Pope, that's a great idea, Ron. The Pope has also made it very clear in some of his pastoral addresses he does not agree with the Trump administration on many, many things. And he would, I think, possibly because he has been so critical of Trump would not entertain the possibility, which is unfortunate. In terms of Diaz-Canel, I agree. I don't think he is particularly popular in Cuba. I don't think he's been a particularly energetic or successful leader. The grandson of Raul Castro, Raulito, in addition to being presented as a party animal, it's also important to bear in mind he is very involved with GAISA, the commercial arm of the Cuban armed forces. So he is very well connected. I think that Cuba badly needs to have economic change, and I think that allowing American investment, allowing greater freedom of small and medium-sized enterprises to be able to function more. These things, I think, are badly needed in Cuba. And this is an opportunity for the Cuban government to try to figure out what can we throw to the Americans to keep them at bay. I think that if the status quo is maintained, this will not work. Cuba has got to provide some concessions to the United States at the moment. This will grate on the nerves of Cuban nationalists, but being pragmatic, I think it's important to bear in mind that the economic situation is in crisis, that there have to be changes, and perhaps looking at whatever Raul Castro, the grandson, is working. And he was in touch with Rubio's handlers just a few days ago in St. Kitts with CARICOM meetings. So there are negotiations, or there are meetings going on. No one knows what the negotiations are about, but no one knew that either in the meetings that took place in Canada and with the Pope. When Obama and Raul Castro opened diplomatic relations. So we're all in the dark. It would be nice to think that change was coming and that Cuba would be left to live.
Thank you, John. And on that optimistic note, or semi-optimistic, wistful note, I want to call our webinar to a close. I really want to thank our two wonderful speakers. Those were amazing, insightful comments about the situation in Cuba and what can be done to overcome the current humanitarian crisis, respond to the glaring needs of Cubans as they're facing this very adverse situation, and what we as individuals and as members of civil society and Canadian citizens can do to try to find solutions to the current crisis. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass it over to Ted.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you, all three of you, for a really rich and productive discussion. Participants put in the chat the kinds of things they wanted to talk about and were priorities for them. I think we've really, thanks to your expertise collectively and individually, we've covered much of that in the last hour and a half. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. There will be a recording of this event, probably ready in a few days, maybe by the end of the week. So we'll check back with our website, Group of 78 website. And there's a lot of follow-up here, obviously, as you've all discussed, from pressuring the Canadian government to even pressuring our airlines to get back in the game here, and people to pull partnerships, which really have a lot of history and anchoring between Canada and Cuba, and broader coalitions. It's a very interesting question what Brazil, Colombia, Spain, Mexico, and Canada could do together. So we really appreciate this. It's been very successful. Appreciate it. About 100 people stayed with us for the whole thing. That shows how much commitment there is, and there is action. And anything we can do at the group of 78 to facilitate action, to support others on this issue, please get in touch. So thank you all. That was tremendous. And
Thanks
thanks for your
everyone.
fine thinking, your fine work. Thank you.